I'm Michael Krasny. I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We include your questions and comments, and we cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely, stimulating topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. Our guest this episode is Washington Post columnist, historian, and foreign policy analyst, and New York Times bestselling author Max Boot. A longtime political conservative, he's a Russian-born naturalized American citizen who now identifies as an anti-Trumpist and was a writer and editor with the Christian Science Monitor and the Wall Street Journal, as well as serving as Jeane Kirkpatrick's Senior Fellow in National Security Studies with the Council on Foreign Relations. His books include The Road Not Taken, The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right, and most recently, the New York Times bestseller Ronald Reagan, His Life and Legend, which he spent 10 years writing. It was named one of the New York Times 2024's 10 best books, as well as one of the year's best books by both the Washington Post and the New Yorker. And I welcome Max Boot. Good to be with you.
Great to be on.
I guess the place I'd like to begin, lots of talk about, to put it mildly, Reagan, Russia, some foreign policy analysis I'd like to get from you, but what's your response to Jeff Bezos in the opinion piece, which you wrote for dutifully for years now, in terms of coming down on the Washington Post and setting some pretty strict rules?
Well, I have a lot of concern and trepidation about what's in store for the Washington Post. I hope that it will remain an independent voice that fearlessly speaks truth to power. Whether that is in fact the case or not, I think remains to be determined.
Well, it seems a little bit grim on that score. I mean, there's been talk of more resignations. There has been a major resignation, and a lot of people feel that this is interfering with freedom to write what you want to write.
Yeah, I think it's very unclear what's going to happen because what Jeff Bezos actually said was he wanted the newspaper editorial page to be devoted to free markets and personal liberty. Well, I'm in favor of free markets and personal liberty. I think all my colleagues on the Washington Post editorial page are as well. So what that means in actual terms, I think remains to be determined. But I hope that the Post will continue practicing fearless, independent journalism because I think America needs that now more than ever.
You're cautiously optimistic then, I take it, or hopeful at least.
I mean, I don't know if I'm optimistic or hopeful. I'm just waiting. I'm taking a wait-and-see attitude to see what happens.
Well, I just want to get the pulse from you. I also want to get the pulse on a lot of other things, including, well, I mean, I keep thinking about Reagan's conservatism, and he was a hero to you. He was an idol to you, and your book sort of takes us in a different direction. It talks about Reagan being maybe the progenitor of Trump, or at least tied to Trump. Some would say maybe even Nixon goes back even before Reagan. But I just read an article that talked about the Gipper and the Grifter. And there were a lot of interesting comparisons and also contrasts. But the biggest contrast in my mind remains viewing what then was the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And Trump, who was regarded by many as just a kind of Putin stooge.
Well, first, let me say that I did not write this book as a commentary on Donald Trump. I mean, I began this book in 2013 when pretty much nobody could have imagined that the host of The Apprentice could one day move into the White House. That would have seemed too far-fetched to seriously entertain at that time. So this is really a book about Ronald Reagan. It's not about Donald Trump, but I think it's understandable that reading this book, a lot of people want to draw lessons or commentaries on the present day. And I will say that there are some continuities between Reagan and Trump, which I'm happy to discuss, but I think the differences are greater than the similarities. And the differences include immigration policy. I mean, for example, Ronald Reagan actually used the slogan in 1980, "Make America Great Again." But when he was asked what would make America great, he often paid tribute to immigration. He paid tribute to the fact that all these people came here to build this country, including his grandparents. So certainly very different attitude towards immigration. And as you mentioned, very different attitude towards what was then the Soviet Union, now Russia, which Ronald Reagan once called the evil empire. And he was a lifelong, staunch anti-communist who was very suspicious of Russian expansionism. And at the same time, he was a staunch Atlanticist. He was somebody who greatly believed in NATO, believed in standing with our European allies, believed in the necessity of keeping American troops in Europe. And in fact, he expanded our nuclear arsenal in Europe with the deployment of the Pershing II and cruise missiles during his presidency to put pressure on the Soviets. So very different approach to issues like immigration and in Russia than the one you see from Trump. And I think in some ways the greatest difference is actually beyond policy. It's a question of temperament because Ronald Reagan was a consummate gentleman. He never engaged in name-calling. He was always the soul of politeness. And he also had this very optimistic, upbeat vision of America as a shining city on a hill that was able, even though he was often controversial, he was also able to bring people together. And I don't see much evidence of Donald Trump even trying to bring people together. He kind of gleefully divides the nation, whereas Reagan was much more of a uniter, which is why he was able in 1984 to win 49 out of 50 states, something that seems too far-fetched to believe today.
It would be inconceivable today, but I also think about Reagan with his optimism and his sanguine view of things compared to Trump in his opening speech, talking about all the carnage and horror and so forth.
Right.
Although recently in front of Congress, he gave a very different kind of speech. But Liz, you mentioned the desire of Russia for land. And let me just talk about that, or expansionism and the way Reagan viewed it. Let me talk about that for a moment with you, because there seems to be a pivot on the part of Zelensky now, after getting essentially bullied in the White House by both Trump and his vice president. We're pretty far off, they essentially said, and that got him kicked out of the Oval Office and left in a kind of disgrace. And now it seems like things have kind of shifted, or the wind has kind of shifted. He's at least fallen back into some grace with Vance and Trump, or appears to have fallen some kind of grace again. And they're talking positively about him, and Reagan and Trump is talking about putting sanctions on Russia again. What do you make of that?
Well, Trump is nothing if not mercurial. I mean, all you have to do is look at his nonstop zigzagging on tariffs on Mexico and Canada, which are on 1 minute off the next. And you can see some of that same mercurial quality in his dealings with Ukraine. But I think it's fair to say that even though he is now talking about putting extra sanctions on Russia, which I would certainly welcome and I think are justified, he has been overall much tougher on Zelensky than on Putin. I mean, he actually called President Zelensky, who was elected and is a popular leader, he called President Zelensky a dictator, and he was asked if he would call Putin a dictator, and he refused to do that. I think more concretely,
he also said, excuse me, Max, that somehow Ukraine invaded Russia rather than vice versa.
Right, he basically blames, if you listen to what Trump says, he basically blames Zelensky, A, for starting the war, and B, for not ending the war, even though, as we know, the war began with an unprovoked invasion by Russia, and the only person who can end the war is Putin, because he could tell his troops to go home tomorrow, and that would be the end of the war. But Trump is, although I'm glad to see him talking about putting some pressure on Russia, he has actually applied far more pressure on Ukraine, including cutting off all U.S. aid, cutting off U.S. intelligence sharing. Those are things that directly undermine Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And perhaps more significantly, from Trump's standpoint, they relieve the pressure on Russia to make any concessions to achieve peace. Because from the Russian perspective, if they see that Trump is cutting off Ukraine, why would they want to stop the war? Why wouldn't they keep going until they get to Kiev? It's creating the wrong incentives for Putin.
Yeah, in fact, Trump is being celebrated in Russia, or was up until today, and I'm just wondering how this is all going to move. There's a trajectory here that suggests that the mercurial side of it that you mentioned makes it unpredictable at this point, where this is all going and whose interests are going to be defended here. Although we've seen a shift in terms of the United States. You mentioned the tariffs, Trump trying to be President McKinley. I'm not sure what he's doing, but we've got a shift here in terms of our allies. They're no longer our allies, or they don't appear to be. The EU is not allied with us. NATO's not allied with us anymore. Things have shifted completely. That's just the antithesis of Ronald Reagan, as you said.
No, absolutely. And this was a point that Prime Minister Trudeau made in response to the tariffs imposed on Canada and Mexico. He said Trump is punishing America's closest allies and trade partners while he is imposing cutting off aid to Ukraine in battling this Russian invasion. How does that make any sense? It really doesn't make any sense. It just shows that I think his foreign policy views are very different from anybody else who has held that office since World War II. And there's a reason why he uses the America First slogan, which, as you know, was the slogan of the pre-war isolationists. Whereas Ronald Reagan, let's remember, Ronald Reagan was a member of the greatest generation. He, lived through World War II. He didn't take part in combat, but he was part of an Air Force film unit. And like most of the people of the greatest generation, the lessons that he drew were America first doesn't work. We don't have the option of just hiding behind our two oceans in the modern world. We have to take an active role in Europe and Asia in particular to ensure that tyrants do not rise up in those areas that will wind up threatening the United States in the way that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan did. And so that's why Ronald Reagan, even though he underwent a profound political shift in his lifetime from being a liberal New Deal Democrat to being a very conservative right-wing Republican, even though his political views shifted, his commitment to an internationalist American foreign policy, that did not change. He remained very much in the FDR, Harry Truman mode throughout his life. And that is something that President Trump seems to have repudiated now.
Well, how do you see this playing itself out? Can Ukraine continue this war and sustain the battles that they have ahead of them without the arms coming from the United States? Because those arms are on hold now. And can Europe make up for that? That's really the central question in my mind, if they have to.
Yeah, I think those are the big questions to which nobody has a great answer. It's clear that a U.S. aid cutoff is going to inflict real punishment on Ukraine and will get a lot of Ukrainians killed, especially if the United States is not providing things like Patriot missile interceptors, which are the most effective defense against ballistic missiles that Ukraine has. You could imagine Ukrainian cities suffering far more damage than they are today. But, Ukraine is still going to fight on. They don't really have any choice because they understand that Putin is trying to wipe out Ukraine as a nation. He denies that Ukraine is even an independent country. So he wants to wipe out Ukrainian identity. And he also his forces commit horrible war crimes in any part of Ukraine that they occupy. So Ukrainians know they have no choice. They are fighting literally for their survival, and they will keep fighting. And they have a lot of assets, not only the fact that they do have strong backing in Europe, and Europe is expanding its defense spending and its defense industry to arm Ukraine, but also the fact that last year, Ukraine manufactured 1.5 million drones. That's a lot more drones than the U.S. manufactured last year. And drones are now the primary weapon system on the front lines of Ukraine. So Ukraine actually has a pretty substantial arms industry of its own. And if the Europeans can step up a little bit, I think Ukraine has a good opportunity to survive even without the United States. But there's no question that the cost of survival without the United States is going to be a lot higher. And Putin's incentives to make a deal are going to be a lot lower if the United States is not backing Ukraine.
But Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons, and some blame Clinton for the fact that they don't, going back to that presidency. We're talking about Reagan and Trump largely, but I wonder if things would have been different. That's just sort of speculation, obviously. But 85% of Russians right now, according to recent polls, want this war to end. Does that factor in at all?
I would be skeptical of any polls in Russia because it's not a free country, but I hope that's the case. But the problem is that, most Russians are kind of cowed by the Putin dictatorship, which is the worst tyranny that Russia has seen since the days of Stalin. So you're not seeing anti-war protests because anybody who protests is going to go to prison. I think the real limitation on Putin is not going to be Russian public opinion so much as the health of the Russian economy and the ability to keep manufacturing war material. And they've, Putin has basically put the Russian economy on a wartime footing, but there's a question about whether he can continue that indefinitely. Inflation is spiking in Russia. You see some real danger signs for the Russian economy, and I think there are question marks about how long he can keep the war going when he's suffering hundreds of thousands of casualties. It's a very deadly and damaging conflict for Russia. So I think it would be a grave mistake for the United States to abandon Ukraine without thinking about the fact that there are also limitations on Russian war-making material, and if we just keep supporting Ukraine, it will actually increase the pressure on Russia to make a deal.
Do you think Ukraine loses Starlink too because of Elon Musk, as some are speculating?
Well, they very well could, but there is a French satellite company which is stepping into the breach and says they can deliver thousands of satellite Wi-Fi terminals to Ukraine in a matter of months. I think, if so, I think that would be a very good thing, because if I'm Ukrainian, I would not count on Elon Musk for my survival.
There are, however, a lot of conservative principles that Ronald Reagan epitomized that seem to be pretty much at work now. And I've got some questions coming in sort of that address these kinds of issues with respect to, I mean, you still consider yourself a conservative, don't you?
I actually don't. I consider myself a centrist. I really don't align with either ideological or political camp right now.
In fact, I'm looking at a question from Mindy Liebeck in Denver, who says, what advice would you give to young conservatives who are disillusioned by the current state of the Republican Party? And in fact, a question from Lindsay Plummer in Houston, Texas, who says, you've been critical of Trumpism. You think the Republican Party can return to its pre-Trump ideals, or has it permanently changed? Those are kind of interlocked questions. Your thoughts as a centrist, perhaps?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of hope for the Republican Party as currently constituted, because I don't see conservatism as being the dominant ideology. I think the dominant ideology is this populist ethno-nationalism, which Trump exemplifies, which I think in many ways is antithetical to what we call conservatism in America, which is basically classical liberalism, a devotion to the Constitution, to freedom, to the principles of our government, the division of power and checks and balances, all these things that Trump is challenging with his attempt to expand executive authority. I don't think there's anything conservative about any of that, and yet the Republican Party is so cowed by him that almost nobody speaks out and criticizes anything he does, even when he's demolishing programs that up until a few months ago Republicans supported, like the International Republican Institute, which supports democracy abroad. Marco Rubio used to be a board member, but up until becoming Secretary of State, and yet now the Trump administration is defunding it. So there are a lot of things that are going on that I think are very antithetical to what the Republican Party has stood for. But the fact that the Republican Party is going along with it suggests to me that this isn't the Republican Party that I grew up with.
You mentioned Rubio. He's done a total 180-degree turn. I mean, he was talking about Putin and Russia in a very critical way, and now he seems to be on board with respect to going after Zelensky and what would happen and getting in the Oval Office. I want to get back, though, to conservative principles, though, because it ties in with your book on Reagan. I remember the old Norquist idea that government ought to be reduced to such a degree that you can get it in the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
Right.
And there's a lot of reducing of government that's going on now. This is what
Yes.
Musk is all about. This is what Ronald Reagan talked about in very passionate terms.
But I want to, Michael, I want to make an important distinction here, because it is true that Ronald Reagan talked about it. And in fact, the most famous quote from his 1981 inaugural address was, "In the present crisis, the government is not the answer to our problems. The government is the problem."
Right.
And so there was a lot of certainly anti-government ideology that has been prominent in the Republican Party for a long time. But when Ronald Reagan set out to address what he viewed as a government that was too big, he didn't just ignore congressional appropriations. He didn't just cut off funding for appropriated and authorized agencies. He did what a normal chief executive does, which is he went to Congress and said, will you please reduce spending on these programs? And Congress did reduce spending on some, although not nearly as much as Reagan wanted. So Reagan worked through the constitutional system, which I think is very different from what Trump and Elon Musk are doing, which is doing an in-run around our Constitution and just unilaterally through executive action trying to destroy large segments of the government. That is not something Reagan ever did.
Since you mentioned USAID funding, I'm looking at a question from Greg Meany from Chicago, who asks, with the loss, and thanks for the question, Greg, with the loss of USAID funding, Rwanda has little to lose and potentially much to gain by annexing Eastern Congo. Is this an example of unintended consequences of the U.S. shift?
Oh, there are so many unintended consequences.
It's a pretty good example, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good example. But I mean, I think the first order consequence of the U.S. aid cutoff is a lot of people are going to die. I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
let's be clear about that, because a lot of people depend on food aid, they depend on medicines from the United States, which they're not getting. So it's going to be a humanitarian disaster, but that humanitarian disaster is going to ripple out into a strategic disaster where we will lose influence. Countries like China will gain influence, and the impact of U.S. aid will be removed, and who knows what will replace it. And it's the example of Rwanda is a good one, or look at the fact that in Syria, the U.S. is paying Kurds to guard Islamic State terrorists in prison camps, and if we stop paying those guards, Islamic State will rise again, and all these terrorists will get out of prison. So there are a lot of potential disasters that will accumulate unless the aid spigot is turned back on.
We'll get back to Reagan and Trump in a moment, but you mentioned China, and Alex Saunders from Tampa, Florida says, how do you assess China's ambitions, particularly in Taiwan and the South China Sea, and how should the U.S. respond?
Well, I think China is licking its chops, looking at what Trump is doing, which is destroying American soft power, hurting America's alliances, and causing America's allies to doubt American will. This is creating a vacuum that China can fill all over the world, and they are moving to fill it. I think this is raising a lot of concern in Taiwan about, if Trump is abandoning Ukraine, is he actually going to stand up for Taiwan? So I think a lot of Taiwanese are very concerned that instead of standing up for Taiwan's independence and freedom, that Trump will do some kind of grand deal with China. And if China promises, to buy some American goods, Trump could very well wind up selling out Taiwan's freedom. I think that is the concern that the Taiwanese have. And I think based on what we've seen so far, that's a legitimate concern.
I was also thinking back to your book about this movie that was made with Dennis Quaid playing Reagan, which I presume you've seen. The subtitle of your book is The Life and Legend. How do you feel they treated that in that script?
Well, quite honestly, I have not seen the movie, but everything I've read suggests that it presents the legend, not the reality of Ronald Reagan, that it's, my understanding is it's full of these myths about Reagan, which I try to show in the book, are not accurate. But I think the reality is actually more interesting and in many ways complementary to Reagan, but very different from what a lot of his supporters believe.
Well, a lot of supporters believe the myths about Trump, too. It's getting harder and harder for many to believe because there are many who are having buyer's remorse, I think. But the reality is that they've bought into those the same way they did about a lot of Reagan's mythology. And it brings up another question. When you talk about the mercurial nature of Trump, how do you assess that in terms of the presidency, along with the aging factor? I mean, Reagan was thought by Helen Caldicott and some others who dealt with him in the Oval Office to have Alzheimer's, and he did, of course, but early on, toward the end of his second term. And there are some who feel that Biden had cognition problems, serious cognition problems. And the same, certainly, with all the Big Macs he's eating and the age he is, could be possible for Trump. What are your thoughts about that, especially in light of the fact that these presidents, are protected and the troops surround them, and it doesn't matter how old they are or how incompetent they might become?
Well, it tells you something that when Reagan was elected at age 69, he was the oldest president ever. And right now he would be a spring chicken compared to either Biden or Trump. Obviously, after Reagan left the presidency in 1994, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so a lot of people wondered, did he have the disease when he was in office? And from what I could determine, the answer is no. And I looked into this pretty closely, talked to his doctors and others, and I don't think he was suffering from dementia when he was in office. But there is no question that he was aging. And this is kind of part of the natural processes. We're all experiencing it ourselves. But he was, as he was getting into his late 60s, he wasn't as sharp as he was before. His memory was fading. He didn't have as much energy. And so there's no question that Reagan at the end of his presidency was not the same person he was at the beginning of it. And I think that's something we should be aware of. And clearly Trump is pretty energetic, but he's close to his 80s. And so that is something that I think should cause concern when he has as much power as he has.
How about giving a mental test to a president before they step into the office? That's done in so many private industry and so forth, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be I don't think you can force them to take it, although Trump always brags about how he took some test and aced it by saying elephant or whatever it was he said.
Yeah, I remember that. Um, there's also that mercurial nature of the presidency that you mentioned that I'd like your thoughts about. I mean, here was Reagan, who was against the ERA, and yet, as you point out in your book, he appointed the first woman to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. Those kind of inconsistencies you can find throughout Reagan's presidency, and you find them throughout just about every presidency.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, uh, any president basically has to react to events, and there are very few presidents who are such consistent ideologues that all their policy runs in one direction and not another. They're often zigzagging, but again, I'm not aware of previous presidents who have made quite as many radical shifts as Trump does. And again, I think tariffs are exhibit A because he keeps announcing these tariffs and then a few days later scales them back and says, "Oh, I'm going to pause them for a month and we'll do it again. We'll have another crisis next month when I'll reimpose the tariffs and the market will melt down again." So that's a level of incoherence and inconsistency that I don't think we've seen before.
Well, we associate Trump, among many other things, with fake news and that whole label that's put on the press, who he called the enemy of the people. Reagan kind of paved the way for him on that, didn't he?
In some ways, although not to the same extent, I don't think anybody has ever trafficked in as many falsehoods as Donald Trump. I mean, listening to his first address to Congress, I had trouble keeping up with how many things he was saying that were false. So it would have been easier just to list all the things he said were true because there weren't that many. In terms of Reagan, I mean, there's no question that he also had a weakness for alternative facts. And as I show in the book, going back to the late 50s, early 60s, he was often citing quotes from communist leaders explaining their dastardly plot to take over America by convincing Americans to pass social welfare legislation such as Medicare and Medicaid, which Reagan called socialized medicine. All these quotes had one thing in common, which was not a single one of them was accurate. They were all basically made up by the John Birch Society to demonize Democrats as closet communists. And yet he sincerely believed them and kept repeating them for years, even sometimes into his presidency. And as I show in the book, I think Reagan had a kind of cavalier disregard for facts on many occasions because what he believed in was the higher truth, the higher ideological truth. And as long as he thought what he was espousing was accurate to that degree, he wasn't too concerned with the individual facts or anecdotes or statistics that he used to back it up. So he often had a weakness for, what he would read in Human Events or National Review or other right-wing publications. He tended to believe it without any fact-checking. But again, while this was certainly a tendency during Reagan's career, like with so many other things, Trump has amplified it to the nth degree. It's like, Reagan times 1,000 in that respect.
Well, when you speak of Reagan believing in higher truths or higher ideals as he saw them, he also believed in the rapture. And I don't know if he believed in astrology like his wife, but, there are these odd kind of notions that he had and cleaved to for most of his adult life and in presidency.
Yeah, no, he certainly believed in astrology, although probably not to the extent that Nancy Reagan did. But yes, and he also had religious beliefs. I mean, he was raised in a very conservative.
The guy with the buttons, right?
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing to me in that is that now Trump seems to see himself to some degree as the savior, or having the hands of the savior having touched him because he wasn't assassinated. And he really, I think, seems to believe that he was saved by God's hand when Hinckley shot him.
Yeah, in March of 1981. But the lesson that Reagan took out of that was that he thought he was saved by the Almighty to lift the threat of nuclear weapons from humanity, to end the Cold War, to lift the threat of World War III. So that was the way Reagan interpreted it. I'm not sure that Trump interprets it in quite the same way, although he also has actually spoken recently about wanting to abolish nuclear weapons. So maybe there's an element of that as well.
Well, Reagan said that Nancy was always whispering in his ear about that. I don't know if Melania is whispering those things into Donald's ear. That remains a mystery to me, and one that I could probably just speculate about without having any authority. Do you think that some of the things you point out about Reagan will sort of tarnish a lot of that mythic image. I mean, you point out how he was much more sympathetic perhaps than he should have been to segregationists, or was able to deal with them, and homophobia type of convictions or beliefs, so to speak.
Well, I'm not looking to, quote unquote, tarnish the Reagan legacy. What I'm looking to do is to understand it and to understand both the good and the bad, his strengths as well as his weaknesses. And I think to date, there has been a lot of hagiography about Ronald Reagan, but there has not been a really objective and balanced account, which is what I set out to do. And I still believe, I agree with the historians. There was a recent poll a few years ago of historians who rated Reagan as, I think, the ninth best president in U.S. history. And I think that's a fair judgment because he did accomplish a lot. But I think we also need to be aware of his shortcomings and failings. And he was certainly somebody who appealed to white backlash politics. He was certainly somebody who ignored the AIDS pandemic, even as it was killing tens of thousands of Americans during his presidency. He was tough on the Soviet Union, and appropriately so, but he was very soft on South Africa. He vetoed a tough sanctions bill to punish apartheid South Africa. So I think we need to understand Reagan as he actually was, not as some supporters imagine he was.
Well, some people say the worst thing under Reagan's presidency was Iran-Contra. Would you agree?
Well, that was certainly the worst scandal. I mean, I think I would actually probably say that the way he ignored the AIDS pandemic was maybe the worst thing, because that was, tens of thousands of people dying, and he didn't even address it rhetorically until 1987. But that wasn't something he was much criticized for at the time.
He didn't address it until Rock Hudson, I think, came out.
Yeah, but even then, he didn't do that much with it. He didn't really galvanize a federal response in the way he should have. But there's no question that Iran-Contra was the biggest scandal on his watch, where his aides basically evaded something called the Bolin Amendment, which forbade aid to the Nicaraguan Contras, and they sold arms to the Iranian regime and illegally funneled the profits to the Contras in Nicaragua. And the irony of Iran-Contra is that Reagan, so he didn't know what Ollie North and John Poindexter were doing, or he claimed not to know what Ollie North and John Poindexter were doing. And if somebody like Richard Nixon had said, "I don't know what my aides are doing," nobody would have believed him. People would have assumed that he was lying. But with Ronald Reagan, that was actually a very plausible alibi, because he often didn't know what folks in his own administration were doing. So he did survive Iran-Contra, but that was certainly a major scandal that marred his last years in office, in particular 86 and 87.
When I think of Reagan and Trump, though, I think of two who came out of a kind of performer's ethos, if there is such a language that's appropriate. I mean, they're both very much tied to that. I'll tell you a quick story that's worth hearing. It was told to me by the author Tobias Wolff, who actually observed this. He was at the White House, I guess, and there was someone there when Reagan was president giving a presentation. You may even know this story, I'm sure you do, with all your research. He was giving a presentation about the Middle East, and he was ambassador from Lebanon to the United States, and he had maps and things. And people said they never saw Reagan look with such attention and diligence. He was mesmerized, and he was staring the whole time. And they couldn't believe it. I mean, because sometimes he would just drift off and eat jelly beans or whatever. Suddenly the talk is over. Reagan gets up, runs over to this ambassador and says, "Anybody ever tell you how much you look like Danny Thomas?"
I had not heard that, but
it's a precious, priceless story in many ways.
It's very plausible, yeah.
Let me go to some more questions for you.
I would add, by the way, in response to what you just said, that it is notable that only two individuals have ever gone from hosting a national television show to being president of the United States. And the first of those was Ronald Reagan, the former host of General Electric Theater in the 1950s.
Well, I remember it. Here's Sally Hanks from San Diego. Thank you for the question, Sally. She wants to know if you believe social media platforms have a responsibility to regulate political content, or does that risk censorship?
I mean, I think that social media platforms have a responsibility not to allow incendiary falsehoods onto their platforms. I think they do have a responsibility an editorial responsibility to some extent, just to set some left and right boundaries. I do think that is important, because otherwise you're just providing a platform for hate mongers, conspiracy theorists, foreign intelligence agencies. You're really turning social media into a cesspool. And I realize there's a lot of controversy over, the idea of editing social or, having any kind of filters on social media platforms. But I think it's absolutely essential while allowing, I certainly believe in free speech, and I believe we should allow the widest possible room for public disagreement, but we shouldn't be allowing people who are inciting violence, for example, we shouldn't, or, espousing Nazism. We shouldn't be allowing, there are limits on what we should be allowing on these major media platforms.
Another question from Peter Granby in Seattle. Thank you, Peter. Given the shift in global power dynamics, what do you see as the greatest geopolitical challenge facing the United States today?
Well, I think in some ways, the greatest geopolitical challenge is the fact that there is increasing cooperation amongst our enemies. You see Russia, China, Iran, North Korea all drawing closer together. In fact, North Korean troops are fighting Ukrainians in Ukraine, and North Korea is providing weapons to Russia. So is Iran. China is not providing weapons, but they're doing a lot of business with Russia. So this is a very concerning development. I think that's why it's imperative for the United States to stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies to counter these autocratic regimes. But unfortunately, what I see with Trump is the opposite, that he's undermining our alliances while he's trying to reach out to hostile dictatorships like the one in the Kremlin.
Also struck by something in your book about Reagan's non-confrontational demeanor or style, as opposed to, Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall. Trump is much more confrontational. I mean, he enjoys confrontation. He thrives on it.
It sure seems like it, yeah. I mean, Ronald Reagan was a very different personality type. He was a much gentler soul. Again, he was not somebody who ever engaged in name-calling. It would be inconceivable to him to describe his political opponents with these derogatory nicknames. The last thing, he was always the soul of politeness, with the manners learned in small-town America in the 19-teens and 20s. And he just, treated people much better than Trump treats people. I think that's a major difference. And Reagan shied away from confrontations with his aides or with his own children or anybody else. He wanted to go along and be liked, whereas Trump also obviously wants to be popular. But I think more than anything, he seems to be motivated by a desire for ratings, for creating drama for its own sake. And even though Reagan himself was an actor, that wasn't his motivation at all.
Now, Reagan had a basic decency, I think, but he could be cruel, and not in the ways that Trump is cruel. I mean, particularly when it came to...
I think Reagan could be thoughtlessly cruel. He could be cruel in ways he didn't realize he was being cruel, but I don't think he would ever do anything deliberately cruel, whereas with Trump, it feels like the cruelty is the point. The cruelty is deliberate.
Yeah, he seems to almost sadistically enjoy it sometimes. I get a thrill out of it, like being at wrestling matches and that sort of thing.
Right.
So what do you see? What do you project? I don't mean for predictions here, but where's this war going to go? Clearly, Trump would like to wrap it up and get out some kind of peace and get himself a Nobel Peace Prize, I guess. He's putting immense pressure on Zelensky, talking like he's putting pressure on Putin, but that's doubtful. Can they wrap it up? Can a real estate magnate bring this to a close?
I don't know. I don't take a lot of confidence from the last time Trump tried to end a war, which of course was in Afghanistan. And he cut out the government of Afghanistan, made a deal with the Taliban, and that ultimately led to the Taliban victory and the collapse of our allies in Afghanistan and a terrible humanitarian tragedy. So I hope he's not applying the Afghanistan template to Ukraine, but I fear he might be.
He's also been talking about a template for Iran, like he's going to do something there imminently. I'm not sure what he has in mind, or if it's just, trolling talk or something along the rhetoric lines. But what do you make of it?
One thing he clearly does not seem to have in mind is military action. I think he's trying to reach out to the Iranians to do a deal. And of course, the Iranians are remembering that the last time they did a deal, which was the nuclear accord with the Obama administration, Trump tore it up in 2018, even though the Iranians, by all accounts, were abiding by its terms. So I'm sure the Iranians are wondering why they would make a deal with Trump, but that seems to be what Trump wants.
Do you ever think this war between Russia and Ukraine would last as long as it has? I mean, it's in the third year now.
No, and I think Russia often surprises by its ability to suffer such terrible punishment. I mean, they've lost more troops than we lost in Iraq, Afghanistan, Korea, and Vietnam combined, and they're still going because Putin doesn't have to worry about popular opinion. But they've suffered much heavier losses than I expected. But it's also very dismaying to see that those losses have not prevented the Russian war machine from continuing.
What else is dismaying to me, Max, and I presume to you as well, and you don't get as much press about it, all these children that have been essentially taken and made into Russians, taken from Ukraine, and the attempt is to try to turn them and morph them into Russians, I guess.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so many war crimes the Russians have committed. That's certainly one of them, kidnapping Ukrainian children, but also, destroying Ukrainian cities under their control. There's a reason why Putin was indicted for war crimes. He is a war criminal, and unfortunately, that's who Trump is now attempting to cozy up to.
I always thought that Trump wanted to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. I mean, that was his ambition for years, and I think it may still be operative in this whole equation.
Could be. It'll be built in Moscow right after he builds the Trump Hotel in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, well, what's your response to that? To turn Gaza into Riviera?
I don't know what to do with that because it's such a crazy thing to say, and yet, so it's such a crazy thing to say, and so you want to say like this is too wild. Why are we even discussing this? But on the other hand, the president of the United States keeps saying this, so you have to kind of wind up discussing it, even though I think the chances of whatever happening are close to zero.
Well, let's discuss economics for a moment, because when I think of Ronald Reagan, I think of trickle-down economics, and I think of those kind of theories and stuff. Trump seems to be, I don't know, like I said, trying to recreate something out of McKinley's playbook, tariffs and the like. It's a whole different scene.
Ronald Reagan was definitely a free trader. He was very much opposed to tariffs because, again, he had lived through the Great Depression. He had seen the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which many blamed for exacerbating the Great Depression. And so he was somebody who believed in the benefits of free trade. So yet another major difference between Reagan and Trump.
So what are the similarities in your mind?
Well, I think the similarities, we've been discussing some of them, the way that both of them played a white backlash politics. They both set out to appoint conservative judges. And I think there are some similarities in their economic policies, which consist of massive tax cuts that disproportionately favor the rich. And I think there is a through line from Reagan to Trump in that respect, because if you look at charts of income inequality in America, they began to diverge pretty rapidly in the early 1980s. It wasn't all Reagan's doing. I mean, there was also the information revolution, there was globalization. There were a lot of things going on, but certainly the Reagan tax policies, his anti-union policies, his antitrust policies, all of that, I think, exacerbated income inequality and thereby set the stage for the rise of both left-wing and right-wing populism in America, because there is so much inequality in our society today. And I think a lot of that traces back to the 1980s. And Trump is now taking advantage of it, but also exacerbating it.
So what's changed for you, you personally? I mean, you were on board with all that, weren't you, for the most part? You were a diehard conservative.
I was focused on Reagan's advocacy for human rights, calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, standing up for captive nations behind the Iron Curtain. All those things were reasons that I became an ardent young Republican in the 1980s. And, I have to say that if I had remained an ardent Republican, I don't think my book on Ronald Reagan would have been all that good. I kind of owe a debt of gratitude to Donald Trump for convincing me to become an ex-Republican and thereby gaining a more objective perspective on the history of the Republican Party and on Ronald Reagan's life.
Well, Donald Trump is an ex-Democrat, and so is Ronald Reagan.
Very true.
I mean, there's all these interesting kind of parallels that come to the fore with your book that make me think of, but there's as you say, a through line that you trace too in the book from Reagan to Trump.
Well, I think the broader through line is really from Barry Goldwater to Trump, because I think the Republican Party started moving to the right in 1964. And what's basically happened is that every generation of Republican leaders has been more right-wing than the previous generation. So Ronald Reagan was well to the right of Nixon and Ford, and now Trump is well to the right of Ronald Reagan, such that if Ronald Reagan were still alive today and still espousing what he once believed in, I'm sure he would be denounced as a rhino, somebody who's not a real Republican, because he believes in free trade, he believes in NATO, he believes in standing up to Russian aggression, he believes in immigration, all these things that are anathema to the modern Republican Party. But the Republican Party has certainly shifted considerably to the right, but I think it's been this continuous shift for 60 years now, and I think that it's culminating in Donald Trump.
Remember, in your heart, you know he's right. That was about Goldwater, and people would play on that word "right" there. No, he's right in terms of his right-wing beliefs.
Right, and OBJ would reply, "In your guts, you know he's nuts."
Yeah, right. Well, we've got the long memories that we share here. My long memory takes me back, though, to Nixon often, because Nixon kind of started off this, what we're talking about as a true line here to some degree that winds up with Trump. But nobody would have been prescient enough to think that it would result in a kind of cult, because that's what the GOP is now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this would be anathema to any previous Republican president. It would be utterly unrecognizable because it's not conservative, as I said. It's ethno-nationalist populism, and it's this cult of the executive, which I think is very anathema to previous Republicans who always talked about the need to limit executive authority and to check federal abuses, and those are all being personified now by the current president.
What about the argument that this ethno-nationalism, at least as far as the United States is concerned, had a lot of its roots in the attempt to create identity politics that became so extreme that they dominated the political scene?
Yeah, I think there's some there's some truth to that. I guess it's kind of a question of how far back do you want to go? Because of course, people on the left who are accused of wokeism, they can reply, well, we're trying to make up for centuries of slavery and segregation and white domination in America, which, it existed as recently as the mid-1960s, where we had actual segregation, apartheid in a large part of our country. And so I think you can make the case that, I think there has been an attempt to move away from that, and I think we have made a lot of progress. But in some cases, I think it has led to what used to be known as political correctness, what people call wokeism today. There have been some excesses on the left, and that's fed this right-wing backlash. But I think fundamentally, a lot of the right-wing backlash is simply to the idea of civil rights and the idea of it's a backlash against white men losing power. So I think there are a lot of things going on, but no question that, signs of minority progress, like President Obama's presidency, I think led to a backlash, and that led to Trump's presidency.
And there are some who think that that may have been more responsible for the Trump presidency than, let's say, going back to Reagan and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think, and in some ways, I think the Republican Party now is in the post-Reagan phase, although there are some continuities. I think it's also so different from what it was in the 1980s that the comparisons are mainly cited by Democrats these days to say, wow, Reagan would be rolling over in his grave if he could see what's happening today.
Patty Davis, Reagan's daughter, has said on a number of occasions that she thinks he's still being used, that his memories of being exploited by the right wing and by the Republican Party. That seems to be the case still.
There's some of that, although it's kind of interesting because you can argue that the Republican Party used to be kind of a cult of Reagan, but that's no longer really the case. It's more a cult of Trump now. And it's very interesting. If you look at polls in the last few years and you ask Republicans, who is your favorite president? It used to be 100% they'd say Ronald Reagan because he was the most beloved Republican. But in polls in the last year or two, Republicans were largely split between Reagan and Trump. And the ones who like Reagan are actually often the ones who are very skeptical of Trump. And you see Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger or others citing the example of Ronald Reagan to criticize Donald Trump, whereas Donald Trump himself has never been a fan of Ronald Reagan. In fact, in the 1980s, he was taking out full-page newspaper ads to say that because of Reagan's policies, other nations around the world were laughing at us. Very familiar rhetoric, which he was deploying against Ronald Reagan back in those days.
Well, you also point out that Reagan was anti-civil rights. He was anti-Medicare, for example. I mean, these kinds of things have loomed in the present administration. They're preeminent in some ways still.
Yeah, no, I think those elements were certainly present with Reagan. And, he certainly criticized civil rights legislation. He certainly criticized Medicare and Medicaid. But once in office, he accommodated himself to these things. He didn't try to repeal the Civil Rights Act. He didn't try to abolish Medicare or Medicaid. He didn't launch this head-on assault on government that you're seeing with Donald Trump. It's you can see some similarities at the level of rhetoric, but in terms of actions, I think they're very different.
Well, Reagan was more a pragmatist in many ways. So was Nixon. I think Trump may turn out to be more an ideologue than either one of them.
I think he's more of an extremist. I don't know that he has a consistent ideology, but he certainly has certain beliefs that he's held for a long time and that he's acting on. Like, for example, his belief that tariffs is the most beautiful word in the English language, which I don't think I've ever heard anybody else say or think. But he has this bizarre devotion to tariffs and thinks that America in the 1890s under McKinley was richer than we've ever been before or since, which is just flat out false. We were actually much poorer in the 1890s, but you just can't convince them of the facts.
Well, he believes in the Gilded Age, that he can restore some kind of sense of what that was as much as he understands it. I mean, this is someone who told us that there were airports during the Revolutionary War, so I don't know what kind of understanding of history he really has or possesses.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a chilling thing to have a president who extols the Gilded Age, which used to be seen as the era of corruption and excess.
Well, it's also the corruption that may be close to his heart in terms of, we had a podcast recently with Sarah Lacey. We were talking about the ascendancy of the tech bros and how they, in fact, I like your thoughts about this, Max. Some have suggested that maybe what's going on here is an attempt to, it sounds conspiratorial perhaps, but just have a kind of yard sale on everything where America is concerned. So that, this ties in with some libertarian philosophy, I suppose. Have everything go to hell and chaotic, and then you can just sell everything off.
I think there's some truth to that. In fact, there were news stories just in the last few days about the Trump administration wanting to sell off all these federal buildings, including the Justice Department building and all these others. And I guess they backed off of that once it became public, but there's certainly an element of that. And, I think the conflicts of interest in this administration are off the charts. They're so well beyond what we would think of as a normal conflict of interest when you have somebody like Elon Musk, who is in de facto control of large chunks of the federal government at the same time that he is one of the largest federal contractors. And he's winning new business for himself, for example, with the FAA using Starlink now to the benefit of Musk while he is cutting funding for, poor people around the world. Again, this is something that would be unimaginable in any previous administration. Imagine how Republicans would react if Kamala Harris had won and had turned over control of the government to George Soros.
Well, you had mentioned before that Reagan was not exactly all that responsive to the apartheid regimes in South Africa. There are those who have tried to link Musk to that. That's his background, isn't it? That's his biography. He grew up in an apartheid state of South Africa.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
You see anything in that?
I don't know enough about his background, but it is telling that he is very critical of the current government of South Africa and convinced Trump that, white people in South Africa are being victimized by the black majority government, which is certainly not how most South Africans view it.
He also is very close to the ADF in Germany and gave that salute that made a lot of people wonder, what the hell is he really about?
Yeah, no, I think both Musk and J.D. Vance have been openly supportive of the AFD, which is this...
I'm sorry, I said ADF. It is AFD.
AFD, right. Many of whose members are associated with neo-Nazism. This is not a party that any previous administration in American history would have supported. And the fact that they're speaking out for it, I think, is very ominous and something that is of great concern to our European allies, or perhaps I should say our former European allies.
They're also a party that has pretty much tried to reduce the Holocaust and sort of dispense with it. Dispense with more than just the guilt or the onus of that guilt.
Yeah, no, it's a very disturbing movement, which which should be opposed by all people of goodwill. And clearly that's not the case with the Trump administration.
So let's end on a maybe a positive note here. Anything hopeful for the years ahead, in your judgment, your vision?
Well, sometimes it's hard to find a silver lining to the dark cloud, but I will say that, America has been through some pretty dire times before, and things certainly looked pretty dark and desperate in the early 1980s when Ronald Reagan took over after Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, the Iran hostage crisis. The country seemed headed for decline, and within a few years, he was able to boast it's morning again in America, and a lot of people, and most people believed him, and he was able to revive the nation's spirits. I think there is still a lot of strength in America in terms of our economic strength, our population. We have a lot. We're still the largest and most successful economy in the world. So I think what we really are failing is not so much with American society per se. It's really with our political leadership. I think we desperately need somebody who will unite the country and bring us together despite our differences. And Trump seems to be moving in the opposite direction. And we need somebody who will work with our Democratic allies instead of cutting them down and seeking common cause with our autocratic adversaries. And again, Trump is moving in the wrong direction. So, I think my hope is that we'll have a different leadership eventually, but it's not going to happen overnight, unfortunately.
Max Boot's recent book is Ronald Reagan, His Life and Legend. Let me first of all thank all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, I invite you to join by going to the website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you may have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. I want to thank the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, and Colleen, and special thanks to this week's guest. Thank you, Max Boot.
Thank you very much.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.